Welcome to part 3 of our Delighting in the Sabbath series, where we're going to be talking about the resting principle. Today you're going to need paper, pen, and the Bible, so I invite you to grab those and you'll need them in a minute. I'm going to start off though with a story. This story is taken from this book, From Sundown to Sundown, by May Ellen Cologne. It's also found in a book that is titled The Seventh Day Ox, so if you want to grab that book at some point, it's a great story. The story is, though, about resting. It illustrates it very well. Wladimir was a Sabbath keeper in Soviet Union. He was in a labor camp in 1948. He'd been sentenced there for 25 years because he refused to work on Sabbath. And when he got to the labor camp, he also refused to work. Every time he refused to work, he was put into a jail cell that was about 3 by 4 feet, and he was only allowed to eat bread and water. He'd get out on Wednesday and he'd be back in by Sabbath, and this went on for a whole year. And one day a general came to visit the camp, and he was inspecting, and he saw Wladimir there in this cell, and he said, "What's up with this guy? What did he do?" And they said, "Well, he's just lazy, stubborn, he's refusing to work." Well, Wladimir was close enough that he could hear them, and he could say to them, "I'm not lazy and I'm not stubborn." He said, "I believe in God, and as a sign of my loyalty to him, I rest on Saturday." He's like, "I'm prepared to work twice as hard on Friday so I can rest on Sabbath." And so the general agreed. He said, "Fine. I want you to provide water for the whole camp of 1,000 prisoners. There is a well outside the camp, and you had to fill a reservoir inside the camp." He was given an ox to help him with this. So for 10 years, Wladimir did this. He and his ox worked together every Friday. They worked twice as hard all week, and they worked twice as hard on Friday to fill up this reservoir with water. But then they could rest on Sabbath. Well, finally, Wladimir was released, but the ox remained behind. And there was another man assigned to fill up the reservoir with water. He was assigned the same ox. And so he started his work, and then Sabbath came, and the ox refused to work. No matter what they tried, this ox would not work. And not just that one Sabbath, it happened repeatedly. And finally, the jailer said in disgust, "You're never going to change that ox's behavior, because the Sabbath keepers made a Sabbath keeper out of that ox, and Sabbath keepers are very stubborn." Well, something interesting how animals can even learn the importance of rest. I saw this also growing up. We had dogs, and we always ate pancakes for our Friday night meal. And we would always feed our dogs leftover pancakes, which they dearly loved. And so one Friday, I remember us cleaning the house, getting ready for Sabbath, and our dog was sitting right outside the screen door, and it was looking in, very interested, and it started licking its chops. And we realized, wow, this dog realized that it's Friday and that there's pancakes coming, even though we hadn't started cooking anything yet. So the importance of resting, even for animals, is just really interesting. Well, you know, if you added up all the Sabbaths in the year, there are 52 in a year, it would equal 7.5 weeks of vacation time. 7.5 weeks of time that God gives us to rest in a year. That's pretty awesome to think about it from that way. So we're going to look at 6 verses really quick. And this is where you're going to need your pen and paper, and I'll invite you to make a table something like this. I'm going to give you the 6 verses as we go along. And the first column, I want you to think about who is commanded to rest. And the second column, from what are they commanded to rest? And then, is there some reason why they are given to rest? And we're going to dig into that, and then we'll ask some questions to kind of reflect on each of those categories when we're done. But let's look at the first one, which is right there in the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. It says this, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." All right, so who is commanded to rest in these verses? Well, first of all, we see it's you, which is the Israelites, your son, your daughter, your male and female servants, your cattle, and your stranger. And from what are they commanded to rest? It says from your labor and work. And why? Well, it said in verse 11, because the Lord made the heavens and earth and he rested and he hallowed and sanctified it, it's to obey God and to follow his example. Our next verse is Exodus 23, verse 12. And it says, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. All right, so who is commanded to rest? In this one it says you, your ox, your donkey, your son of the female servant, and your stranger. And you were to rest also here, similar to Exodus 20, from our work. But this is the nugget that I like, especially in this verse. It says that you may be refreshed. That is why we're told to rest. Our third verse is now in Exodus 16, and we've read this story before in Exodus 16 of the quails and the manna, but we're going to read just verses 27 to 30. Exodus 16, 27 to 30. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, that is the manna, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the 7th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. Okay, so Israel is commanded, that's the who, to rest from gathering manna. And verse 28 tells us the why. He says, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? So it was to obey. The reason to rest was to obey. Our next verse, number 4, is found in Exodus 34, 21. Exodus 34, 21. And it says, 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. So you is commanded to rest. And from what? This is just a little bit different from some of the other verses, very specific, saying from plowing and harvesting. And I personally can't find a why in this particular verse, so I left that one blank. But let's go now to Isaiah 58. This is interesting to think about from the perspective of rest. What are we to rest from? Isaiah 58, 13 and 14, it says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. So you, the Israelites, were commanded to rest, and they were to rest, interestingly enough, from doing their own pleasure, from doing their own ways, from finding their own pleasure, from speaking their own words. So those are some unique things they're told to rest from. And verse 14 gives us why. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. So delighting yourself in the Lord was the reason why. And then our last verse is in Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13. And we're going to read verses 15 to 22. Nehemiah 13, verses 15 to 22. In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And they warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods, and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do thus, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on the city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut, and I charged that they must not be opened till after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. Then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I'll lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. All right, so who is commanded to rest? We see that the people of Judah and the men of Tyre are commanded to rest. We see them being commanded to rest from treading wine presses, from bringing in sheaves, from loading transport, from selling provisions and goods, including food items, which is why many people choose not to eat out on Sabbath because of this verse and partially also with Exodus 16. And why are they commanded to rest? In verse 18, it talks about, did not your fathers do thus? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on the city? Do this, meaning profaning the Sabbath. So they were told, don't break it because God brought disaster on our forefathers, because part of the reason being they broke the Sabbath and they profaned it. All right, so let's kind of look at the big picture. Let's think about the who column. The column of who is commanded to rest on the Sabbath. What can we learn about who is commanded? Well, it looks like pretty much anyone is commanded to rest. Anybody in the Sabbath keeper's property or in the Sabbath keeper's sphere, anybody in your sphere, you are not to cause to work. So think about it though. Does it matter if we know them or not? Just family and friends, people we meet at church, or who? It seems to not matter if we know them, because it talks about the stranger as being also commanded to rest. And does it matter if we're the same religion or not? I seriously doubt it, because clearly these men of Tyre in the Nehemiah story did not have the same beliefs about Sabbath, and they were commanded, hey, as long as you're on our property and we're involved, we're not doing business on Sabbath. So it doesn't seem to matter who, anybody within your sphere, you should not cause to work. What can we learn about the what column? What we're to rest from? Well, we see all kinds of work described that they were to rest from. It sounds like business as usual was to stop, including, this is one we'll talk about in a little bit, but your own thoughts and your own words and your own pleasure, that was also to stop. One meaning of the Sabbath is to stop or to cease. And so it's interesting, it's important to remember that God asks us to stop doing things in order to give us rest. It's not a legalistic, it's not a bad thing that he asks us to stop. For example, I remember when I was a student in school, and I would intentionally stop doing all schoolwork on Sabbath because I believe that's work. And I want my mind to be focused on God. The day is there to delight in God. And so I would do nothing with schoolwork on Sabbath. And I loved Sabbath, especially when I was in school, because stopping doing schoolwork, what a blessing to be asked to stop doing that and to take a break and refresh my mind and spend time with God and other fellow believers. So what about this why column? Why are we commanded to rest? And there's some beautiful thoughts that come out here. Well, one is obedience. We're told to follow God's example and to keep his commandments and his laws, and it helps us avoid disaster and punishments from God. So obedience is one reason we should obey, should rest. Another is simply trusting. It helps us trust God. Think about it. The Israelites had to gather twice as much manna on Friday, and they had to trust it would not spoil overnight. When it would any other night, it would turn, it would spoil and get maggots and worms and things on it, but not on Friday night to Saturday. It would stay beautiful and edible and everything. Psalms 37:7 says that we should rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. So there's something about resting that helps us trust and grow our patience and our trust in God. So that's one of the reasons we're commanded to rest. Another reason, I think, is for health reasons. This is hinted at in the Exodus 23:12 verse that talked about you being refreshed. And you think about it, we're told not to work. Clearly, there's a physical stopping of work and a physical rest that's involved, and it's good for our health to have that break. But also, I think there's a spiritual soul rest. It talks about that, I think, in Isaiah 58, when it talks about delighting yourself in the Lord. That's a soul rest. And Jesus put it this way in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." It's a beautiful call to rest and why God wants us to rest. So how does resting help us delight ourselves in the Lord very specifically? Well, I think you think about it like doing less. When you rest from all these other activities, it opens up time and space to spend with God. You think about it in a dating relationship scenario. If you were going on a date and you said, just a minute, I need to do my dishes first, or I need to go shopping while we're running around on our errands, or when you're taking me out to eat, that's sometimes what we kind of do to God. We just give him the bare crumbs instead of our full attention, 24 hours. It's a day to delight in him, and if we rest from all these other activities, it helps us truly delight in him. This is a story shared by Joanne Davidson in her video on YouTube called The Great Sabbath Welcome. There was a Jewish businessman in Jerusalem, and he hired Jews and Palestinians to work for him. And every Friday night, he'd shut down his business, he'd go home, he'd reconnect with his 2 teenage sons after a busy week, and he'd find refreshment on Sabbath all day, and he would just feel very rejuvenated and at peace after Sabbath. And Sunday morning, he'd go back to work. One of his Palestinian workers commented and said to him, "I'm not ready to be a Jew yet, but I envy your Sabbath." Think about it. Would other people say that to you? Would they envy your Sabbath because you get to rest and all the blessings that come from resting that God has in store for you? So let's talk about just a couple practical tips as we wrap up. One question to think about is, okay, well, since we're commanded to rest, is it appropriate to catch up on sleep and sleep all day Sabbath? Is that appropriate? Well, I'm going to read a short quote from Counsels for the Church, page 270. It says, "It's displeasing to God for Sabbath keepers to sleep during much of the Sabbath. They dishonor their Creator in so doing, and by their example say that the 6 days are too precious for them to spend in resting. They must make money, although it be by robbing themselves of needed sleep, which they make up by sleeping away holy time." So think about it. Are you skimping on sleep the 6 days to get everything done, and then you're absolutely exhausted and you're kind of worthless on Sabbath because you're so mentally, physically exhausted? That's actually dishonoring to God. He wants us to be able to find that balance and be able to spend time with him on Sabbath. So that's something to think about as far as naps and resting. Yes, it is a chance for us to catch up physically and rest from our duties, but it shouldn't be entirely spent sleeping and skipping church and Sabbath school by sleeping in and things like that just because you were working the past week. A practical tip that I'd like to point out that is very difficult for me and a lot of people is resting our tongues, our mouths, because the verse talked about speaking our own words. We're to rest from speaking our own words. So, Ellen White says this in Child Guidance, page 529. "The fourth commandment is virtually transgressed by conversing upon worldly things or by engaging in light and trifling conversation. Talking upon anything or everything which comes to mind is speaking our own words." So this is a very difficult thing to control, and you sit down at potluck or you're visiting with people Sabbath afternoon, it's very difficult to keep conversations off from worldly everyday topics and onto something that's Christ-centered and uplifting and inspiring. I came across this idea though to help with this, and I will share it with you. And it's a list of topics, and this particular list is compiled from about 3 different sources, and it's titled Inspiring Topics. So I first encountered this. I went over to somebody's house Sabbath afternoon, and they passed this around. They said, "I want everybody to pick one of these items off from this page, and I want you to share that with the group." And so we each did that, and it was such a blessing, and it's just very special things like tell how you became a Christian, or what questions would you like to ask God when you get to heaven? Or what spiritual lesson is God teaching you in your life? Lots of interesting questions, and there's 61 on this particular page that just help you honor God with your conversations and your words on Sabbath. So I encourage you to think about how you can rest on the Sabbath. Maybe you say, "I need to rest from so much screen time. I need to de-scream my life a lot more on Sabbath, or maybe I need to rest more and combine it with some time in nature, or I definitely need to rest from laundry, from yard work, from cooking, from exercising, from dishes, from working, from errands, from shopping, from eating out, from schoolwork, from news, email. There's so many things that we can rest from. And I just challenge you to ask God how you can incorporate this principle of resting in your life and find true joy and delight in the Sabbath by doing that.